As you know, there are two track types in Pro Tools that support MIDI, and they are a MIDI track and an instrument track. So let's look in more detail at each of these. A MIDI track has both a MIDI input selector, which is right here, and a MIDI output selector, which is right below it. The MIDI output selector is where you can select which virtual instrument you want this MIDI channel to control or send its MIDI data to. This input is selected to receive all data from all MIDI channels. If we wanted our track to only receive a certain MIDI channel, we could set that up here and choose a predefined MIDI channel from one of our input devices. This next button right here is our automation button. It's where we tell Pro Tools to read or write or turn off the actual MIDI automation data. We also have a pan knob for each MIDI track. If we pan the knob all the way to the left, it shows a value of 64. And if we pan it all the way to the right, we see a value of 63 for a total of 127, which, as you know, is the default parameters for velocity, pan, and every other variable in the MIDI protocol. Here we have our record enable button and solo and mute buttons, as well as a volume fader that controls the overall volume of our MIDI data, and that value also goes from 0 to 127. The same data can also be found on an instrument track. However, it's laid out in a slightly different way. All of your MIDI input and output data is shown up here. Here's your MIDI input and your MIDI output selector. And also here is your MIDI data. So same idea as on a MIDI channel. It's your MIDI volume. If you click on it, you get a fader. And then also a pan knob. So we can pan our virtual instrument left or right. And it's actually panning the instrument itself. You can see, watch the pan here change. And then option, click on it to get it to go back to 0. So there's our MIDI input and output, our MIDI volume, and our MIDI pan information. Down here is obviously our audio output path selector to route our audio, since we have our virtual instrument on the same track as our MIDI data. As you know, that's the definition of an instrument track, contains all the functionality of both a MIDI track and an auxiliary track together. So we have our audio output pan knobs as well, and then a track record enable button, as well as solo mute buttons and volume faders. This volume fader, again, though, is just for the audio portion. Our actual volume controlling the MIDI volume of the instrument is up here. MIDI through allows Pro Tools to pass the MIDI data coming from your keyboard through Pro Tools and to your virtual instrument. To give you an example of that, if I play my keyboard right now, I am sending MIDI data from my keyboard to Pro Tools, and then it is passing that information along to the virtual instrument. In order for that to happen, we have to have MIDI through enabled. So if we record right now, okay, it's recording all those notes. Now if we turn MIDI through off, which is under the options menu, we turn MIDI through off and go ahead and hit record again. I'm playing, but we're not hearing it. If we play back now, we will hear it. The reason for that is, with MIDI through off, Pro Tools cannot pass that data through while we're recording it. It'll record it, and then it'll play it back. It won't allow us to record the data and have it pass through at the same time without MIDI through being on. For that reason, nearly always we have MIDI through on. There is also something in Pro Tools called the default through instrument. Now, the default through instrument determines the virtual instrument or MIDI output that gets triggered under two conditions. Either when you play your MIDI controller and you don't have a track record enabled, or when you audition a MIDI clip from the clip list. So let me show you where you set up first your default instrument. It's under the Setup drop-down menu, Preferences, under the MIDI tab, and right here, Default Through Instrument. Now, if it's set to none, what that means is that when you go to play your keyboard, if you don't have a track enabled, Pro Tools, even though I'm playing the keyboard, will not play. Okay, no sound. And that's as you would think it would be. If I record and enable the track, you're going to hear audio. When it's not being record enabled, you don't hear anything. The same would hold true if you come over here to the edit window and you try to play one of these clips by option clicking and clicking on a MIDI clip. They won't play because right now we have no default instrument assigned. And remember, those are the two conditions under which a default instrument would play, is when we have a track not record enabled or when we're trying to audition a clip. So now let's go turn on our default through instrument. There's a variety of settings we can use. We can use any virtual instrument that is instantiated on a auxiliary input track or an instrument track. But I find that the most useful default through instrument setting is this one. Follows first selected MIDI track. What that means is that when we have no track record enabled, Pro Tools will still play a sound based on whichever track we have selected. Now I know that this MIDI track is triggering a bass sound. So if I select that track, it's going to play a bass sound, even though no track is record enabled. If I select this track right here, I know that this virtual instrument is set to play the Rhodes. So when it says first selected track, it's talking about either top to bottom or left to right. So the first selected instrument, top to bottom, it's going to play a bass sound. And if we select this, it will play the Rhodes sound. Same over here. If we select one of these MIDI clips, it's going to play the MIDI clip through the virtual instrument that is selected, the first selected virtual instrument. So if I click on one of these, option click it, and hold it down, it's going to play that MIDI clip through this particular virtual instrument, the first one that's selected. I could do the same thing if I click on this track. Now, when I play this clip, it's going to play that same MIDI clip, but with the bass sound. Okay, so that is the default through instrument.